Welcome to day 4 of our 7 days through Leviticus series. And the one, the one little section of Leviticus that I always kind of think, okay, this is going to be hard work, is chapters 13 to 15, where we're reading about the laws of leprosy and the bodily discharge laws. And isn't it amazing that of all of the devotions that I've done so far in Leviticus, today is the one, what I saw in these very chapters is the one that's moved me the most. Okay, so I'm going to read you from Leviticus chapter 15, from verses 25 to 27. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, other than the time of her customary impurity, that was her normal monthly cycle, or if it runs beyond her usual time of impurity, all the days of her unclean discharge shall be as the days of her customary impurity. She shall be unclean. Every bed on which she lies all the days of her discharge shall be to her as the bed of her impurity, and whatever she sits on shall be unclean, as the uncleanness of her impurity. Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. He shall wash his clothes and bathe in water and be unclean until evening. Now, let those words be fresh in your mind as I read to you from Mark chapter 5. This is verses 25 to 34. Now a certain woman had a flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." This woman was suffering from the very affliction that we read about in Leviticus chapter 15 today. She had an unusual flow of blood that was unstopped, and for her it had been continuing like this for 12 years. But those verses from Leviticus give us an insight into the impact that would have had on her life, being a Jewish woman, living amongst a Jewish community, no one of which would have wanted to have touched her or be anywhere near her. In Leviticus it said if she touched anyone, they became ritually unclean. That means you couldn't go to the temple, you couldn't participate in any of the normal rituals and the religious life of Israel. You were exempted from all of it if you were unclean. And if she touched anyone, they would have become unclean until evening. If she had touched anything that they touched, they would have become unclean. If she'd sat on something that they then sat on, she would have been unclean. This woman would have been treated like a leper for 12 years of her life. She would have been shunned and rejected, and she would have been incredibly lonely and full of shame. It gives us an insight into the desperation of this woman as she pushes through this crowd. I am going to get to Jesus. I'm going to get to him. He can make me well. And he can make me clean. You know, every person she touched as she muscled her way through that crowd, every one of them was being made unclean as she was working her way through the crowd. But she knew when she got to Jesus, something completely different would happen. In the Old Testament, if something unclean were to touch one of the priests who were set apart and they were clean and they were meant to perform some duty in the temple, if they touched something unclean, they themselves, though they were a priest and clean, they would have been defiled by that and been unclean until evening, and then they couldn't do their duty. So a priest, even a priest, set apart for the work of the ministry, clean in the eyes of God ritually, was made unclean by touching an unclean thing. Think about that. And yet here is the one human being on the planet, the only one who's ever lived, that when an unclean person comes and touches him, he is not made unclean by them, but they are made clean by him. You think about that. That is incredibly powerful. That is an incredible illustration and display of the gospel. If you, with a sense of your own uncleanness, as this woman had, if you have a desperation in your heart to be made clean, to be made whole again, you can come to Jesus. I don't care what you've done. I don't care how filthy it was, how evil it was. I don't care how disqualified it makes you feel. I don't care what you've done in your life. If you come with humility and faith, as this woman did, and you touch the person of Jesus, he is not defiled by what you've done. In fact, the opposite will happen. He will make you clean again. What a promise. What a promise of the gospel. That it doesn't matter what you've done, you can be made clean if you will come with humility and faith. So come, my friend. Don't wait any longer. Don't delay. Come to Jesus with all your filth, with all your uncleanness. Though the whole world reject you because of what you've done, come to Jesus with humility and faith, and he will make you well and clean again. Amen. See you tomorrow.